What I'm going to tell you happened in October 2018. I'd just started my first semester as an exchange student in the United States. My name is Kawe, and at the time I was living in a small rented apartment near the university in San Mateo, California. During the day, I divided my time between classes and an internship in a physics lab, which was exhausting but rewarding. At night, whenever I could, I liked to go out with some colleagues to unwind. It was on one of these nights that everything happened. I remember we were at the local mall, a kind of refuge for those who wanted to escape the boredom of a university campus. I was with Oliver, a young man from New York with a loud and infectious laugh, and Emma, who always had a camera around her neck, ready to capture any interesting moment. After spending almost 2 hours exploring shops and eating fast food, we decided it was time to go home. The apartment was about 7 blocks away, so we always made the journey on foot. That day, for some reason, I suggested a shortcut that went through a park that, until then, I thought I knew. Emma didn't like the idea very much and said it would be better to go the usual route, but Oliver supported me, saying that we could save time. We convinced Emma to join us, and we started walking through the park, which seemed even quieter and emptier than I remembered. The only thing that really caught our eye was a small house with a quirky garden. There was a pruned owl-shaped bush, so perfectly detailed it was almost surreal. We even took a photo before moving on. As we progressed, the silence of the park began to bother me. I used to find tranquility in places like this, but that night the air felt different, heavy, almost suffocating. It was then that I saw, in the distance, a building that seemed vaguely familiar to me. "I think it's our building," I remarked to Oliver, pointing to an antenna at the top. He agreed, but Emma said she didn't recognize anything from it. We kept walking, but the closer we got, the more the surrounding streets seemed deserted and lifeless, as if we were moving away from the city instead of getting closer. Just ahead, we saw something that caught our attention. An unfinished building with exposed beams and concrete walls. There was an empty pool out front, full of dry leaves, and a stone staircase that seemed to lead to the main road. "Maybe it's a shortcut," I suggested, trying to sound confident, but inside I was already starting to feel uneasy. As I took a few steps toward the stairs, a loud sound echoed through the room, breaking the silence. It was the creaking of a rusty door. We all froze. From a side entrance, a man came out, carrying something in his arms that we couldn't identify from a distance. He didn't seem to notice us, but the way he moved, slow, almost dragged, gave me goosebumps. "Let's get out of here," Emma whispered, holding my arm tightly. I agreed without question, and we went back to the street. We decided to pick up the phone to check the GPS, but the problem started there. My phone only had 2% battery, Oliver was without a phone, and Emma's seemed to crash whenever we tried to open the app. Even so, we managed to plot a route back, but things only got worse. Every corner we turned took us to unknown places. It was as if the map did not correspond to the real world. After walking aimlessly for almost half an hour, we passed a quirky shop. The facade was painted vibrant red, and the sign read "Perdido's Goods" in crooked letters, as if someone had painted it in a hurry. Something in that store made me uncomfortable. Emma commented that it looked like a facade from a horror movie, and Oliver joked that maybe we were on the wrong GPS track. But the discomfort only increased when, after walking a few more blocks, we passed the same store again. It was identical in every detail, the letters, the colors, even a rusty bicycle leaning against the wall. "What's going on?" I asked, feeling my voice crack. We tried to change the route on the GPS, but after a few more turns, there it was. Again, the red store, with that same crooked sign. This time we stopped and tried to analyze what was happening. Emma started taking pictures to try to prove that we weren't crazy, but even looking at the images, we couldn't find an explanation. It was as if we were stuck in a loop, repeating the same route endlessly. We then decided to do something different, completely ignore the GPS and follow the main road, even if it was longer. As we walked, silence seemed to surround us, heavy, almost palpable. The streets that had previously been busy were now empty, and even the streetlights seemed to be farther from each other. Emma quickened her pace, visibly nervous, while Oliver tried to keep the tone light, making disjointed jokes about the horror movie we were in. But even he didn't seem to believe his own words. That's when we found a sign indicating the entrance to an urbanization called Evergreen Court. We didn't remember seeing that place before, but it felt like a way out of the loop. We enter the street, passing old houses with weathered white picket fences and unkempt lawns. The feeling of being watched returned, but this time it was stronger. I looked back several times, hoping to see someone following us, but the street was empty. Oliver whispered that he had heard footsteps behind us, but when we all looked, there was nothing. After a few minutes, we found a small corner market. The fluorescent lights flashed, and an elderly lady with thinning gray hair stood behind the counter. She watched us curiously as we entered. We asked her if she knew how to get to the address of our building. Her expression changed immediately. "You're lost, aren't you?" he asked, in a hoarse voice and an accent that's hard to identify. I showed her the GPS, but she just shook her head. "These streets, and they don't always lead to the same place." Her comment gave us goosebumps. We tried to explain what was happening, but she just pointed to the door and said, "Go ahead, but don't stop anymore. And when you reach the intersection with the fallen sign, choose the path on the right, never the left." We didn't know if she was joking or if she really believed what she was saying, but at that point we decided to take the advice. We quickly thanked him and left the market. The silence outside seemed even more oppressive now, as if the environment itself was waiting for our next steps. We left the market and headed down the street towards the intersection you mentioned. The walk seemed endless, and the sound of our footsteps echoed in a way that made it seem like there were more people walking with us. Finally, we spotted the fallen sign, leaning against a rusty pole. It was so damaged that it was impossible to read what was written. We hesitated for a moment, but decided to go to the right, as the woman had indicated. Something about the way she looked at us before we left made me believe that, even though it was strange, her advice was serious. The path on the right led us to a wider road, with few lights and several trees that leaned towards the sidewalk. The feeling of being watched came back with full force, but this time it was different. I felt as if someone was hiding among the trees, just watching us go by. Suddenly we heard a dry noise, like the cracking of a branch. We all stopped at the same time, holding our breath. Oliver pointed to the dark, but we couldn't see anything but the shadows cast by the trees. "We will keep moving. Don't stop," I whispered, trying to appear calmer than I really was. After walking a few more minutes, we spotted something that made us freeze. It was the red store again. This time, however, the lights were off, and the place seemed even stranger than before. We tried to ignore it and continue down the road, but for some reason, at every step it felt like we were moving further away from the place we knew. That's when Oliver suddenly stopped and pointed straight ahead. In the middle of the road, there was a standing figure, almost motionless. We couldn't tell if it was a person or something else, but the shape seemed to be staring at us. Without exchanging words, we turned around and started walking in the opposite direction as fast as we could without running. The sound of our accelerated steps mixed with the sound of our heart beating strongly. It was impossible to know if we were moving away from it or if we were once again stuck in the same loop. It was then that in the distance we saw the dim lights of a vehicle. It looked like a taxi. We ran up to him, waving desperately, and to our relief he stopped. The driver, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, asked us where we were going. We gave the address and got in the car without looking back. The silence inside the taxi was almost as oppressive as that of the streets where we had walked. The driver, whose name on the badge read Roy, seemed calm, but there was something about his posture that bothered me. He drove slowly, as if he were analyzing each curve with excessive attention. Several times we exchanged uneasy looks, but no one said anything. At a certain point, I began to observe the external environment more closely through the window. The streets seemed even more deserted, and even in the dim light of the streetlights, I could not identify any familiar spots. It was as if we were going deeper into a place that shouldn't exist. As we progressed, the car began to make strange noises. The engine creaked, and a sound of shuffling metal echoed under the vehicle. "Damn it," Roy muttered, parking the cab on the side of the road. He went out to check on what was going on, leaving us alone in the car. I looked through the rear window, and I swear I saw a silhouette in the distance, standing in the middle of the road. I blinked a few times, but the figure remained there. "Do you see that?" I asked, pointing. Everyone looked, and in a few seconds the figure simply disappeared. Roy returned to the car, visibly shaken. "The tire is perfect, but a piece of tin was stuck in it. I'll try to turn it around." He started the car and started maneuvering, but when he turned the steering wheel, the engine simply died. The car lights went out, and we were swallowed up in total darkness. The only sound was our heavy breathing and the wind blowing outside. Roy tried to start the car several times, but to no avail. Finally, he sighed and said, "You're going to have to help me push. We need to get the car out of here." We got out of the car hesitantly, illuminating the area with the dim flashlights of our cell phones. The darkness was almost tangible, and the air felt heavy, as if something invisible was watching us. As we began to push the taxi, the sound of tires squeaking on the asphalt echoed in an almost ghostly manner. Roy instructed us to keep the pace, but there was a palpable tension in the air. That's when we heard it. Steps, slow, dragged, but unmistakable. It came from somewhere behind us. My first reaction was to turn to look, but I immediately remembered what Roy had said in the car. "Don't look back." The steps continued, now closer. Oliver began to tremble visibly, and Emma grabbed my arm tightly, whispering, "What's going on?" Roy was quiet, but his heavy breathing betrayed that he was also afraid. "Keep pushing, don't stop," he ordered, his voice firm but with a slight tremor. We obeyed, and the taxi finally started moving, but the footsteps seemed to follow us, keeping pace. At one point, I had the impression of hearing something else, irregular breathing, as if someone were panting right next to us. After a few minutes that seemed like an eternity, we managed to push the taxi to a flatter area. Roy tried to start it again, and to our relief, the engine finally roared back to life. We ran to get into the car, but it was at that moment that Emma let out a scream. In the reflection of the rear window, she saw something. Something she couldn't describe. She just babbled that it was weird, distorted. Before I could process what she said, Roy stepped on the gas, pulling the car out of there with a speed that had me glued to my seat. As the car picked up speed, I had the feeling that something was following us. I don't know if it was paranoia or something more real, but the sound of footsteps seemed to still echo in my mind. Roy drove as if his life depended on it, and maybe it did. He made a sharp turn, and finally I saw something familiar, the intersection that led back to the city. The lights of civilization have never looked so welcoming. When we stopped in front of my building, no one moved for a few seconds. We just stood there, taking a deep breath, trying to understand what had just happened. When we finally got out of the car, the silence of the street seemed almost deafening, as if the chaos of that road had made us more sensitive to sound. Roy left first, shrugging his shoulders as if to shake off an invisible weight. Emma held my arm so tightly that her hand trembled. Oliver remained in the back seat for a few seconds, staring blankly into the void. No one wanted to be the first to speak. It was as if putting it into words gave even more power to whatever followed us that night. After a few moments of hesitation, Roy turned to us with a more serious look than I had ever seen on him. "Listen, what happened there? No one will understand, so it's better for us to leave it between us." His voice was firm, but there was something in his eyes, something that revealed that he didn't completely believe what he said. He knew that what we experienced was not something that could simply be forgotten or ignored. We agreed with a nod, but the discomfort in the air persisted, like an invisible spectator among us. As we walked into the building, I noticed something strange. The lights in the hallway flickered erratically, and the air was different, colder than it should have been. When I got to the door of my apartment, I found the key, but my hand was shaking so much that it took me a few seconds to unlock the door. Emma and Oliver decided to sleep there that night without even arguing. None of us wanted to be alone. Roy, however, declined the invitation, saying he needed to return home. He quickly said goodbye and left before we could insist. Once inside the apartment, we tried to act normally. We made coffee, turned on the television and tried to distract ourselves, but no one could really relax. Every sound from the building, every noise coming from the street seemed amplified, as if something was just waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Emma, who had always been the most rational of us, finally broke her silence. "Do you think that... Is it still here?" She didn't have to explain what it was. We all knew exactly what she was talking about. The night was long and filled with heavy silence. We tried to sleep in the living room, but the tension was almost palpable. Emma dozed off on the sofa, with her face turned to the backrest, while Oliver, lying on the floor, staring at the ceiling. I sat in the armchair with my eyes fixed on the window. With every movement of the curtains, my heart raced. Outside, everything seemed normal, but there was a strange sensation in the air, as if something was watching us. Around 3 in the morning, we heard a noise coming from the hallway. It was a rhythmic sound, like shuffling footsteps, but not enough to sound like an ordinary person walking. Emma opened her eyes immediately, and Oliver sat up, paralyzed. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, swallowing. The sound stopped for a few seconds and then started again, closer this time. It was not my imagination. We were all listening. Without thinking too much, I got up and went to the door to look into the peephole. The hallway was empty, but the lights kept flashing as before. I stood there for a few seconds, my heart beating so fast that it seemed to echo through the apartment. Suddenly I heard a faint knock on the door. It wasn't high, but enough to freeze me. I took a deep breath, trying to look brave, but I knew something was very wrong. When I turned to the others, I saw in their faces the same fear that I felt. We decided that we would not open the door no matter what. Oliver, who had brought his backpack, pulled out a small knife he used for camping trips and held it tight. Emma took a lampshade, the heaviest object she could find, and I, not knowing what else to do, took one of the chairs from the dining table and positioned it as if it were a shield. We stood there, waiting, while the silence in the hallway became even more oppressive. There were no more beats, but there was no sound at all either. The silence dragged like a weight on us. We felt that something was lurking, just waiting. Then suddenly a high-pitched sound cut through the air. It was a creak, as if the door to the apartment next door had been opened. I looked through the peephole again, and this time I saw something. It wasn't clear, but there was a shadow moving down the hallway. The corridor was not long, but the shadow took time to reach our field of vision. When I finally got a better look at her, my hands started sweating. He was a tall, thin figure, covered by a hood that obscured his face. The movement seemed disconnected, as if the arms and legs were not in sync. The most disturbing thing was the sound it made as it walked, a low crack, like bones moving out of place. Emma pulled me by the arm. "Did you see what it was?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I couldn't take my eyes off the peephole. The figure stopped with his back to our door and stood motionless for a time that seemed like an eternity. Oliver, next to me, was also trying to see something, but I pushed him back slightly. "Stay away from the door," I muttered. It was then that something even stranger happened. The figure began to turn slowly, until it seemed to be looking directly at us, as if it knew we were there. But it shouldn't be possible. I knew that the peephole only allowed vision from the inside out. The hallway light flashed again, and the shadow disappeared. Only this time we didn't hear footsteps moving away. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. We stayed there in absolute silence until the sound of something falling inside the apartment made us jump. It was a painting on the wall which fell for no apparent reason. The frame shattered on impact, scattering pieces of glass across the floor. "That's not normal," Oliver said, his voice barely audible. I was paralyzed, watching the glass spread. On the floor. The sound of the impact still resonated in my head, but it was soon lost in the silence, which seemed denser than before. Emma was trembling, and Oliver had his hand on the knife, his eyes fixed on the door. The feeling of being watched only increased, as if someone was watching us at all times, although there was no one visible. Every little noise, every crack on the walls or floor made our hearts race. We decided that we could not stay there. We needed to get out, find a way to get out of there, but the streets were still empty and gloomy. Oliver, with the knife still in hand, got up first and looked out the window. He seemed to analyze his every move, as if he were calculating the best way to get out without being seen. "We have to go now," he said, his voice firm, but with a tremor I couldn't disguise. I didn't know what to think, but the idea of staying there, at the mercy of that being, was unbearable. We quickly left the apartment, but as soon as the door closed behind us, a feeling of discomfort took hold of everything. The hallway was empty, but the presence of something, or someone, was still there. The environment seemed more oppressive. The shadows seemed denser, and the footsteps became sharper. Our every move echoed as if we were being followed. Emma, panting, pulled me by the arm. "We can't stay here. Something is not right." We decided to go down the stairs, but the building looked higher than the last time we were there. The ladder never seemed to end. Each step that went down gave us the feeling that we were still on the same floor. As we advanced, a growing tension set in, as if time was distorted. The staircase never looked like the staircase I remembered. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, we arrived at the ground floor. The building no longer had that familiar smell, that soft echo of the walls. Everything was strangely muffled, as if the air had been compressed. There were no traffic sounds outside, not a living soul could be heard. Emma, Oliver, and I looked at each other in silence, knowing that the feeling of being in a collective nightmare was not a thing of our imagination. I felt as if we had been removed from reality, and this new dimension we were in seemed to be ruled by some unseen force. We decided to go out into the street, but as soon as we arrived at the door of the building, the surprise was even greater. The street was empty, but in a different way than usual. What once seemed to be a busy area at night, with a few pedestrians and parked cars, was now a deserted road, as if time had been erased. We couldn't hear anything. I looked around trying to find some sign of life, but there was nothing but the elongated shadows and the echo of our own footsteps. Emma pulled me by the arm again, her eyes wide. I don't know what's going on. This is not normal. I don't think we're in our city." His voice trembled, and this only increased my apprehension. I tried to find something familiar in the setting, but everything was distorted, as if everything we knew had been altered on a profound level. It was then that a faint light appeared in the distance, like a lighthouse cutting through the darkness. "Let's go over there," Oliver suggested, already starting to walk. The light came from a corner where the path seemed to narrow, as if inviting us to move forward. The sound of our footsteps echoed throughout the silent street. Our every move seemed amplified, as if the universe was listening to everything. The light ahead began to pulse in a strange way, almost as if it was adjusting to our rhythm. As we approached, something unbelievable happened. The street turned abruptly, as if the scenery had changed instantly. The light we saw before was now no longer in front of us, but to our left. We were back in the same place. The streets, the building, the air. It was as if nothing had changed, as if we had circled back to the starting point. "That's not possible," Emma murmured, her eyes widening as she looked around in astonishment. The feeling of being stuck in a loop only increased. We tried to turn around, but the path again took us to the same corner, to the same street, as if we were walking in endless circles. I was looking at the GPS, but the signal was completely lost. What once seemed like a useful device to guide us was now useless, as if the system itself was trying to keep us in that place without explanation. I controlled my breathing, and in a moment of desperation, suggested that we try the other street. There was no longer any logic in what we were doing, but it seemed to be our only option. We walked, but each time we advanced, the street seemed to stretch, as if the city was swallowing us little by little. It was as if there was no more end, no more limits, no more control over what we were experiencing. I felt smaller and smaller, as if the city itself was devouring us. It was then that, as we turned a new corner, we saw a figure on the horizon. A person standing, motionless. What disturbed me the most was that, although the distance was great, there was something wrong with that being. The silhouette was distorted, as if the shadows were clinging to the figure in an unnatural way. Emma stopped suddenly, almost stumbling, her eyes fixed on the figure. "This isn't real," she whispered, her words so low I could barely hear them. I wanted to run, but fear paralyzed us all. The figure remained there, not moving, but its eyes. His eyes shone in a way I couldn't understand. It was as if they were illuminated by an inner light, something that was not seen in the physical world. The silhouette contorted in a disconcerting way, as if it was trying to adjust to its surroundings, as if reality itself was not able to contain that presence. It was then that something even stranger happened. A low, almost imperceptible sound began to emanate from the bottom of the street. It wasn't a human voice, but something that sounded more like a distorted whisper, as if the walls themselves were trying to communicate something to us. The sound got stronger, closer, and in that instant, I knew we weren't the only ones there anymore. Something was surrounding us. The feeling that we were being watched intensified, and the weight of those shadows seemed to squeeze us. I looked at Emma and Oliver, and neither of us knew what to do. The sound got closer and closer, and I could feel my heart racing, beating hard in my chest. It was as if we were being pulled into that figure, as if we had no choice but to walk into the unknown. The light in the silhouette's eyes seemed to hypnotize us, and I, who had previously intended to run, now found myself taking slow, almost involuntary steps. Emma tried to pull me back, but to my surprise, her own feet seemed to be glued to the ground. I can't move," she said in a trembling voice. I tried to scream, but my throat was dry, as if the words wouldn't come out. Oliver was also paralyzed, his eyes fixed on the figure ahead. Finally, the whisper turned into a high-pitched scream, so loud it made the ground shake beneath our feet. It was a sound so piercing that it seemed to cut through the flesh, as if something was trying to communicate directly with our souls. The figure in front began to move, but not in a normal way. His arms stretched out in an unnatural way, as if it were disintegrating, as if the very physical form of that presence was something malleable, distorted by the laws of reality. That thing, that presence, took a step toward us, and it was at that moment that, like a reflex, the fear turned into panic. I no longer knew where I was, who I was, or why I was there. I just wanted to get out, but somehow the way back seemed to have disappeared. I looked back and realized that the street was gone. What was once an open road was now closing, as if space was shrinking around us. The three of us were now in an invisible prison, not knowing how or why it was happening. And then, without further warning, the figure crumbled before us. There was no sound, no movement. It simply disappeared, as if it had never existed. The environment around us began to change as well. The streets began to reorganize, as if reality were correcting some mistake. Silence took over, and the world that once seemed threatening and distorted now seemed normal again. But the feeling of discomfort did not dissipate. Something was wrong, and we knew it. We met again on the street where we had started, but everything seemed so empty. The lights of the shops were off, the streets still deserted. Time, somehow, had stopped. I looked at my friends, and none of us knew what to do next. We decided, wordlessly, to move on, until we finally found our way back to our building. We arrived at the building in a state of total silence, without a word exchanged between us. The door opened with the usual sound, but at that moment, any noise seemed amplified, as if the building was aware of our arrival. We went up the stairs, in silence, with the feeling that somehow that place was no longer the same, as if the walls had absorbed the moments we lived that night and now look at us with a different coldness. As we entered the apartment, the lights were on, as if nothing had happened. It was as if the world outside had never been changed, but in my head the images of the empty street, the distorted figure, and the whispers were still vivid. I looked at my friends, and their looks said it all. No one wanted to be alone. We decided, without saying a word, to gather in the center of the room, trying to find some logical explanation for what had happened. But as time went on, it became clear that nothing made sense. We all sat on the floor, speechless, just listening to the sound of our breaths. Reality seemed to have been distorted in a way that we could understand, as if we were in a nightmare that we couldn't wake up to. The fear had given way to a sense of lingering unease, as if an invisible shadow was still following us, watching us. Every movement, every sound in the house seemed amplified, as if everything around us was compressing. On that night that seemed endless, we decided to stay all together in the living room. No one wanted to risk being alone. The sound of the wind hitting the windows and the ticking of the clock on the wall were the only sounds that broke the silence. No one could sleep. My body was tense. The feeling of being watched did not disappear. I felt that something was still watching us, even inside that apartment. The night passed slowly, and the thoughts were filled with distorted images of the streets, the park, and that figure. But nothing felt as real as the feeling that something had followed us from there. When morning finally came, we were still immersed in that feeling of discomfort. The sun poured in through the windows, but even the daylight didn't seem to ease the tension. It was as if, as much as we tried to ignore it, the experience of the night before was stuck to our skins. We talked briefly about what had happened, trying to find some kind of logical explanation, but no one could. No theory seemed to make sense. The idea that we had just lost ourselves and that it was all just an effect of anxiety seemed ridiculous now. There was no way to explain the looping of the streets, nor the presence of that figure. Whatever it was, it didn't seem to have a reasonable explanation. We didn't know how to deal with it, but we also couldn't just ignore what happened. Something in us said that this experience was far from being just an episode of mental confusion or a simple chance. I knew the answer was there, somewhere, but how could I explain it? Perhaps the streets and houses we saw were not what they seemed. Maybe the city was somehow altered, or maybe we ourselves were, in a strange and inexplicable way, stuck in some kind of cycle. I didn't know. What I knew was that the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Every noise in the street, every shadow, seemed to remind us that something was still behind it all, as if, even after we returned home, a part of that place was still with us. We tried to leave everything behind, move on with our lives and move on. But time has not been kind to us. When we left for university that morning, after a whole night, without getting enough sleep, something in me said that somewhere in that maze of streets, whatever had followed us was still there, as if it was only a matter of time before it happened again. And the worst of all is that, when I look back at the building where I live, I always wonder if that place doesn't hide some secret. If there is something in it that we cannot see, but that in some way observes us. I don't know what happened that night, and I may never know. But as much as I try to forget, whenever I pass through the streets and see that park or that red store, an uncomfortable feeling haunts me. And maybe, at some point I need to go back there and find out what really happened. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel.